God's Book, an honest look at the Bible's 7 toughest topics.
Well, welcome to this introductory session to our series, God's Book. We're going to go on a journey together through the whole of the Bible story from Genesis all the way to Revelation. You're going to see not only how the whole Bible forms a big story that centers on Jesus, but you're also going to see how do we make sense of the 7 most difficult, challenging topics in the Bible. You know, I think this is really important. I love the Bible, but I've learned over the years as I've studied it that while I love the Bible, that doesn't mean I like all of it or find it all easy or convenient. But of course, if it's God's truth, it's unlikely that I'm just going to find it all easy or convenient, that it's all just going to fit in with what I think or what culture says. No, there's going to be some challenge. But listen, the reason you go to the gym or learn a new language or take a new course is because you want to take on a challenge. You want to improve your understanding or performance. So think of this series like that. We're going to take on some real challenges. By the end of this, there's going to be nothing in the Bible that you haven't wrestled with that's really challenging. You're going to know there's no lurking secrets or difficult bits that could pop out in the future. We've got it all out on the table. We've opened and lifted the lid on the Bible. And I can remember the importance of this for me personally in my journey with the Bible. I grew up taking the Bible on trust, grateful for parents who read the Bible to me. But I remember one time on a beach actually talking to a man who said to me that the Bible was full of contradictions. And I said, no, it isn't. He said, yes, it is. And I said, no, it isn't. And in the end, he said, well, have you actually read it? And I found that difficult because I'd had bits of it read to me, and then he said, but have you read all of it? And I had to admit I hadn't. And he said, well, how do you know it's not full of contradictions then? That was the end of the conversation. He won. But it was the beginning of an adventure or a challenge for me. I began to read the whole Bible. I thought I need to sort this out. I read I'm not necessarily recommending this, but I read from Genesis to Revelation. And actually what I realized is that these 66 books written by different authors over thousands of years, far from being full of contradictions, what I was struck by is how much coherence, harmony, and unity the Bible has. It's one of many reasons why I trust the Bible, and I believe you can as well. It has miraculous harmony. Things prophesied hundreds of years earlier, foretold, are fulfilled in Jesus. You can't make that stuff up. It's miraculous. There are other reasons I trust the Bible. I've traveled to the lands of the Bible. I've walked through Hezekiah's tunnel, if you know that story. I've been to the pool of Siloam where Jesus healed a blind man. These aren't fairy stories. You can go to these locations and you can see the hard evidence, archaeology and history reinforce the Bible. So I believe the Bible is true. But when I read through the Bible stories in response to that man's challenge, what actually struck me was not the issue of contradiction. What struck me was how much warfare and violence there was in the Bible. What struck me was how some of the teachings about judgment seem really severe. What struck me was that the teachings about sex are very different to how our culture thinks. These are the topics that may disturb you when you actually get round to reading the Bible. And that's what God's Book, this new series, is all about. We're going to tackle the 7 toughest topics in their chronological order, because I believe when you put these topics back in their original context, things start to make so much more sense. When you understand that Genesis is not a scientific textbook, primarily, but it tells a story in an ancient context of how God made the world, then you will realize you don't have to choose between science and the Bible. When you see that Israel engaged in warfare to conquer the promised land, you'll realize, but that was a unique moment in its context. That doesn't give permission today for warfare and violence. When you realize that the teachings of Paul about sex actually challenged Roman male masters who abused prostitutes and slaves, women and children, and taught them to control themselves and to honor the weak and vulnerable, you realize that teaching caused a sexual revolution in the first century that we still benefit from today. In other words, put these 7 topics back in their context and things begin to make a lot more sense. So how can you get the most out of this series? Well, I encourage you to firstly prioritize being part of the whole thing. From the next session, we'll dive in with Genesis and we'll look at the issue of science and creation. Then we'll look at Exodus, Leviticus, and the strange laws of Moses, including slavery. Then we'll look at the warfare in the stories of Joshua. Then we'll look at the suffering in the stories of exile, the problem of pain in our lives. Then we'll see the miracles and exorcisms of Jesus in the Gospels. We'll look at the subject of sex in the teachings of Paul in the New Testament, and we'll finish in Revelation with the theme of judgment in the very final visions of the Bible. So prioritize the whole journey. It's going to make so much more sense if you see how each piece of the jigsaw fits together. Secondly, between sessions, have a good read of the book that I've written. I can only share briefly in these small group times, but there's so much more content in this, including letters I've written to my children and short chapters on each of these 7 topics to unpack them in a practical and accessible way. This is not about being an academic. You don't have to be clever to make sense of this. I've written it for you, to make sense for you in your everyday life. So journey through the whole story. Dive into my book between sessions, and most importantly of all, do it together. Wrestle with these topics in community. None of us can make sense of the Bible on our own. We need each other. We need the wisdom of scholars over the centuries. I channel through that through in my book. But we also need the help of each other with the Holy Spirit. When you meet, pray and ask God to speak to you through each other. He's promised that the same Spirit who inspired the Bible now informs, inspires, and illuminates you as you meet together in His presence. So enjoy this series, God's Book, and make sense of the Bible's toughest topics together. Let's go for it.